Hi, I'm Ellen Halliday, Deputy Editor of Prospect. You're about to watch the interview portion of the latest episode of the Prospect podcast with this week's special guest. For the full episode with additional discussion from Prospect Senior Editor Alona Ferber and myself, click the link in the description below to listen via your favourite podcast app. And if you'd like to read more of Prospect's award-winning journalism, visit prospectmagazine.co.uk.
So, Sarah Manavis, thank you so much for joining us today on the Prospect podcast. We are recording this on the day after Americans went to the polls. So you are an American citizen. You are a woman.
Yes, I am.
Trump has won. How are you feeling today?
Yeah, I was saying until this past weekend that I wasn't going to be surprised if Trump won. That Iowa poll did give me a slightly different impression, obviously a false impression for a few days there, but I'm not hugely surprised. I'm surprised he won the popular vote. And I don't feel amazing, I have to say. But yeah, I'm not necessarily surprised that this is the outcome today.
What, you're from Ohio, is that right?
Yes.
Is that
usually
yeah.
a swing state, but not this time, obviously. And as we know, no, definitely not a swing state. But yeah, no, I voted in the Montgomery County district. It's a suburb of Dayton, Ohio. So I'm essentially, if you look at a very, very, very faintly blue bubble in Ohio, that's where at least my vote sits. So I'm from like small town, quote unquote, real America, Rust Belt. Where I grew up was not necessarily that, that part of America is definitely hit hard. My particular town, I would say, is more, gives you a better picture of what generally the United States is like, rather than like a real Rust Belt litmus test. But I definitely think I have, rather than, these coastal fake Americans, a better perspective on what the actual mood is just growing up somewhere that wasn't a super metropolitan area. I definitely thought he was going to do well in Ohio. I knew that in Dayton, if you look at a map of Ohio specifically, there are about 5 little blue patches, and it's Dayton, Cincinnati, Cleveland, Columbus, and I think Akron Toledo. So you can obviously see, much like the rest of the US, that you have these sort of like rural or very suburban sweeps that look very red, and then you have these little sort of blue dots where the cities are. But yeah, I think I'm more or less, I haven't been to the United States since 2020. And certainly the people that I still speak to from home are, for the most part, would have been voting for Kamala Harris. But I do think there was a little bit of, not necessarily naivety, but maybe like false hope, optimism, if you were looking at the last few weeks of polls and thinking that a Harris win was in the bag. I think I felt that Trump was moving that way just because of past polling and also just the mood in general in the United States, and also Harris's very sort of like high enthusiasm start in July, and then what felt like a real falling off the side of a cliff in terms of enthusiasm. But I don't think many people from Ohio thought that other people from Ohio were going to vote for Harris. And yeah, I'm certainly not surprised that it went so strongly for Trump.
Yeah. We're going to get on in a bit to talk about the reporting that you did for Prospect, which was all about kind of this conservative trend among women, particularly like younger women, as expressed on social media platforms, and with these kind of tradwife or like conservative influencers. But just before we do, one more election question. I mean, one of the things that seems like kind of a bit surprising this morning, the day after the election, is that actually a lot of women did, it looks like, vote for Trump, or fewer maybe voted for Kamala Harris than would have been expected. And that was really a kind of centerpiece of her campaign, the idea that women were going to come out in big numbers. I mean, what do you think that maybe tells us about American women's priorities, the issues they care about? What are your thoughts?
Well, I think I've sort of been trying to wrestle with this myself. And obviously we're recording this in the immediate aftermath, so I think hopefully in the coming days we'll have a better picture. But the thing that I really continue to go back to, and I say continue to go back to after the 12 hours of knowing about this, but the thing I continue to go back to in the last 12 hours is that you do look at those states where abortion, for example, was on the ballot, and that, women actually did go out in droves. And even where it didn't pass, like in Florida, they still had a majority. It needed 60% to pass, but over 50% voted to enshrine abortion protections into law. And so then I think people go, okay, so if there were presumably women going out and voting for this, then how do you square that with Kamala Harris doing worse than projected, it would seem, at this stage among women? And I do think it is, like, for me, I really do think it is a failing of the Democratic Party to put policy really at the front of this campaign. I mean, as much as Kamala Harris was like fun vibes and certainly I think felt like a positive departure from Joe Biden, especially after the debate. I mean, all these things that we already know. I do think that that the campaign failed to really say, here's what we're going to do on abortion. Here's what we're going to do on these specific policies. And I think that is where people were voting. And I think it almost is like an indictment of how the Democrats view the average voter, thinking they won't care about those things. So I do think that's right, that women weren't necessarily totally convinced by Kamala Harris, even though they did obviously care about things like abortion. And one thing I will say as well is in North Carolina, that state, I mean, I don't know if it was totally flipped by this, but that state had a very, very strong young person voter turnout for Trump. So I think there are all these assumptions that we have about how people are going to vote, or certainly that I think the Democratic campaign had assumptions about, that I just don't think actually reflect the true picture of things. And also, crucially, I think those people weren't really being met by this campaign. And that's, again, 12 hours. That would be my diagnosis on things.
Well, this brings us really neatly back to your piece, which we ran in the latest issue of Prospect magazine, which is all about a trend of young women and girls buying into kind of misogynistic thinking, becoming kind of influenced by women anti-feminist influencers on the internet. And in the piece, you argue that we're not paying as much attention to this trend as we are to the trend of growing misogyny among young men. So you wrote about this for us. And how do you see, this is still slightly election related. How do you see that trend of young women kind of getting kind of being attracted to these sort of anti-feminist ideas? How do you relate that to Christian kind of nationalism? How do you connect the trend you wrote about for us with what Trump represents for women in the US?
Well, I think it does, when it comes to this piece at the very least, I do think it comes down to this idea of lifestyle. I think that's really, really played on. I mean, obviously, I think the socioeconomic reality, and in particular, more specifically, the economic reality for young Americans or American women is a part of this too, and is a part of the trend amongst younger women. But I do think there is this thing where you are having this idea of what family should be, what a life should be, how a life should be led for the average American, for even young Americans, that is very, very popular online right now. And so, I mean, I think Alona, you and I, when I was writing that piece, it was in the middle of filing it, JD Vance said the lonely cat lady thing. And it was like, that's exactly what is being played on here. It's these fears around a sort of an idea of a lifestyle that liberals, quote unquote liberals, the left, the Democrats are taking you towards. And we, the Republicans, Trump, JD Vance, whoever. I mean, and even you can say people like Ted Cruz. I mean, you can really go, again, the whole Republican Party. We're here to offer you this thing that is secure. It ensures your economic, financial future, and it gives you a lifestyle where it's full of leisure, it's full of beauty. And that really, really is then being echoed on social media platforms, both explicitly, but more often, I think, really implicitly in a way that becomes effective as this sort of combining together co-message, coalescent idea. So I think that is, like, in terms of women and particularly young women, I think that's where that campaign, was probably pretty effective. Again, we don't fully know, but I think those messages will have really resonated with young women.
Describe for us a bit what you see on the accounts of these tradwives or other kind of anti-feminist influencers. What are they presenting to the wider world through their platforms?
I mean, I think I see three distinct groups, which I sort of describe in the piece, which is first a very obvious group, which is people who are Gen Z women who are talking heads. I mean, they're political commentators. They're usually doing a podcast, and they're saying things. They're presenting themselves as political figures. They're talking directly about politics, saying things as extreme as women shouldn't be able to vote. You have that sort of group. Then you have this sort of divergent, what I guess you would call like the tradwife kind of space, where you have people that are, again, almost in an in-between way, doing quite explicit promotion of a misogynistic perspective of how women should be and how women should lead their lives, where you have women dressing up, very much trying to fit the male gaze, explicitly telling you you should be a wife, you should not be going to university. If you do, you need to prioritize your wifely duties. Here's how you can make your husband happy when he gets home from work, dress up, blah, blah, blah. And then finally, this third group, which I think is the most effective and probably the most dangerous, is the ones that are doing that implicitly. So you have people who are not saying this is how you should be, but going online and presenting this really quite enticing vision of a perfect life where you're a mother, you're a wife, you're baking bread from scratch, you're milking cows, you're dressed beautifully, and you just happen to have this husband who provides everything for you and these children who are happy in this perfect, happy life. And that's where I think what I think those look like. And that final group is, I think, the ones who are really the most effective in all of this.
And for listeners who might have like not seen any of this, like we're talking about like woman makes kind of video of herself cooking and looking after kids, wearing nice, like give us a bit of a sense of what you see if you watch this stuff.
Well, I would actually say that the ones that are I say they're the most effective because even I enjoy watching some of them, and I'm certainly not buying into some of these beliefs. But you have a woman speaking. You're hearing a voiceover on the video. It's a TikTok, it's an Instagram reel, and they say, "We're going to make my husband is coming home from work in an hour, and I'm going to make him a 3-course dinner." And you see her in in a ball gown and dressed beautifully, like cracking eggs that the chickens laid out in your chicken coop in the back. And you're getting this sort of cake together, but you're also making a steak and making this beautiful chimichurri. And it's all presented in these sort of very modern aesthetics. Not all the time, but a lot of the time it's like it's in a kitchen that looks like it's in an architectural digest magazine kind of photo shoot. It's in these very modern sort of environments, and it looks like the content that you would see from someone who is like a recipe influencer, someone who's just teaching you how to cook or doing that kinds of things, or like a lifestyle influencer who's vlogging her day in her beautiful mansion. But instead you have this sort of packaged message of like, look at what I'm doing, look at who I'm doing it for. And isn't this just the most soothing, wonderful life? And again, like, I'm not necessarily watching it for that reason, but I am enjoying watching her bake a cake and wearing a really nice vintage Gucci outfit. Like I'm not. It's easy to see how people buy into it and how it does sort of give you a break from reality for a few seconds.
I think this does raise a lot of really interesting questions about who this is for, because I'll be honest, the algorithm also sends me these videos sometimes, and I have stumbled across some of them. I've been, for the first few seconds, not entirely sure what it is I'm watching, because it is like, it's a beautiful scene, there's a voiceover. I follow chefs on Instagram who do things similarly without the kind of subtext of conservative political value, so it can take you a while to know what exactly is going on. But yeah, who do we think these videos are for? I mean, you mentioned, potentially in some creators there's a performance for like the male gaze, but also a lot of these videos do seem targeted at women who maybe aspire to have a more beautiful life full of joy that they actually struggle to find in their reality. So how much do we know about who they're targeting or who these videos resonate with?
I think the first thing to say about who these videos target is that we don't really fully know. I think that is the one question mark over this, where we do have to say we are taking a guess, but I do think it is an educated guess. You can look at some of these influencers, and I do think a small fraction of them target the male gaze, like you say. You have men in the comments saying, "Oh, you're the perfect wife. Oh, you're the most beautiful woman." And those women are very politically useful. They show right-wing men that there are women out there who do perform these duties, who do fit this ideal that we're promoting ourselves. But I do think that is really only a fraction of what is the larger ecosystem, where they are targeting not necessarily all women, but I do think that the audience is not necessarily that specific. It's certainly playing on women who are maybe lonely, are economically and socially like sort of disenfranchised, I guess you could say, who are sitting in their flat share by themselves, and they're getting promoted this video, and they're like, God, wouldn't that be nice? And it's fair enough to think that if that is your economic and social reality. But I do think it is kind of targeted at all women. Again, it's like, I get these videos in my feeds. I don't know anybody. I don't know a single person who doesn't have these videos appearing on their feeds all the time. And it's because they are very visually and emotionally appealing. And so I think that's where they are very effective. And also, it's worth mentioning that those types of videos circumvent political filters, algorithmic sort of filters. They really are the softest version of this content, so it flies compared to anything else. And so, yeah, you just end up with this massive audience where you're casting a really wide net, and it works because you do have people, even like me, who are going, yeah, fair enough. I could see how you could keep watching, Nara Smith is the classic example. Keep watching Nara Smith videos on an endless loop, and an hour's gone by, and you don't even think about what those consequences are. And I don't think for everyone there are consequences. I think for most people there probably aren't, but there will certainly be young women who see that and go, maybe I should be doing things differently.
Guys, just a quick follow-up question related to those like filters that you mentioned and how these kind of videos fly onto these platforms because they're this softer version. I can't think of examples of a similar kind of content but with a sort of different political persuasion that also gets the same traction. Like Alona and I were talking before, is there a version where there's a woman who's, raising her children communally?
Yeah, like in an anarchist commune, and everybody's making yogurt together or
Yeah.
something,
Yeah.
You don't see that.
Yeah.
No,
So
you don't.
is there something in the platforms that, like, literally the way the algorithms are set up that means this kind of stuff does well? Or are these women just actually very effective at, at creating an emotional connection with other people on these platforms?
I mean, my guess would be, and I do think it is an educated guess, is that it has to do with what the current aesthetics are of most trends online. I think it's what looks the most like the most popular content. And the most popular content is lifestyle, vlog style content from lifestyle influencers. And so if you're going to I think if you did make a video that was like me and my commune all making chickpea pasta or whatever, but you did it in this like sort of Kardashian aesthetic kitchen, and you had beautiful clothes, and it maybe had a sponsored element and great lighting, then I think that there is a reality in which that kind of content does really fly. But I think that why this is so successful is because you could be flicking through your feed and see, I don't know, in 20 videos, see 3 other ones that look exactly like that, but do not have that sort of implicit message attached to them. So I think it's that it fits within what is the current trendy aesthetic on social media platforms, whether it's TikTok, Instagram, whatever.
When it comes to the kind of the explicit political stuff, during the election campaign, did you see American anti-feminist influencers sort of giving direct political messaging about voting? Like, you should be voting for Donald Trump, or does it not get that overtly political?
It's interesting because I was actually thinking about this today, like not even really relating to, I was actually complaining about like a American football player's wife on Instagram, who was overtly political on her Instagram account. But I think for the most part, they are avoiding it because I think it does sort of break the spell of what they're doing. And it's also not really necessarily what they're trying to achieve. I don't think they're trying to achieve a Donald Trump presidency. A Donald Trump presidency, I'm sure, is preferable to their aims than a Kamala Harris presidency. However, I think that they don't care enough about the electoral side of things, at least as so far as it goes to like presidential politics. But they know that it will alienate their audience, and they know that their audience is going to them because they see it as a soothing break from reality. So why bring that in? So I think that a lot of them, while certainly will be voting for Donald Trump, I think most of them will steer clear of it because they know that they actually do better by pretending that it's depoliticized. It's an apolitical space on their feeds, which of course it isn't.
Some of the kind of controversy around the concept of a tradwife or these influencers more kind of traditional clean image that we've talked about is that they're somehow like trapped or like deprived of their agency. So there are like specific examples of some of these influencers who people have reported on and said kind of help her, like she needs help. But there's, in a way, these are highly successful women who are making a lot of money. Maybe they have people who work for them and help them to create their content. So how do we reconcile that idea of like this criticism of these influencers with the idea that actually maybe they've made an active choice and maybe they're just very good at what they do?
Well, I think that, and I didn't get into this in the piece, but I do think that is sort of like a deep irony in a lot of these accounts, is that these women are, for the most part, I would say at least the very, very famous ones, they are the people that they're the breadwinner. They're the ones who are making the money for their family. I mean, they are raking in money through sponsorships, um, and even just monetizing their usual content in platforms like YouTube. They're making a ton of money doing this. And of course, like that sort of upends this whole like, I'm just documenting my life while my husband goes and does blah, 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 blah. But again, I think it is one of those things that a lot of people don't really think about. And B, you do get into this sort of like choice feminism kind of territory where you go, oh, well, they want to do that. That's their right. And I don't necessarily think that anybody's saying you shouldn't be able to like film yourself, I don't know, going through your chicken coop. But like, I obviously think that the idea, I think that that is like a little bit of cognitive dissonance and suspended disbelief that does happen for a lot of these viewers when they're saying, I'm watching this stay-at-home mom, but you're not watching a stay-at-home mom at all. You're watching a full-time content creator who's probably making well into six figures, if not in some cases, probably getting near to seven.
Now, you're watching a media empire or something,
Exactly. Yeah, that's
huge.
100% correct.
Yeah. And we've talked on the podcast before about the kind of the spaces online where men get radicalized by a kind of extreme misogyny. And as you cover in the piece, everybody talks about the radicalization of young men, and how we need to be really, we need to worry about the potential kind of impacts of this, and potential violence, incel attacks, all that kind of stuff. And when you look at what's happening to young women who watch this stuff, do you think this is radicalization as well? And if it is, why don't you think it gets as much attention as what happens to young men?
I mean, I definitely would call it radicalization. I don't think everybody who's watching tradwife content is radicalized, but I do certainly think the people who are going so far, again, and like the people that we're really speaking about in this piece, the people who are watching those videos and truly having their minds changed in a very permanent and material way, I think those people are radicalized. And I think we're sort of afraid to say that because it feels like it's over egging what the power these influencers have. But I think that's where they're the most successful. And I think that's why we're not calling it radicalization, is because you say, how can you be radicalized by watching, again, videos of people doing homesteading content on Instagram? But that's exactly, I mean, again, not to overemphasize this, but that is what's happening. You are having the same sort of beliefs, the same sort of value system being very heavily adopted. It's just through different means. And why I think it's really important and why I do think it is very successful is because we have so few conversations about it, because it's a much softer way in than what Andrew Tate is saying or any of these sort of alpha influencers are saying. And also, which I think mentioned in the piece, or maybe I didn't, but there is that really immediate term consequence with men, that violence is the immediate term consequence, which is way less of a risk with women. But that doesn't mean, just because we're not going to have immediate term violence, doesn't mean that it's not an extreme risk, or indeed that it doesn't mean that violence is a consequence of that down the line.
And I mean, if it's advocating stripping away of rights that currently belong to half of the population, that's pretty serious.
Well, and it's also like, I think I said this in the piece too, like I was speaking to one of the experts who really, I mean, all three of them really said this, but one very explicitly was saying, like, what happens when half of the population, I mean, if we're really taking this to the full extreme, is not participating in democracy? Like, there are all of these other implications on, and I mean, it goes beyond just women's rights, but women's rights is obviously the main thing. But what happens when we don't have half the population participating in these things? And I think that that is like a really underplayed and underrated risk. And I mean, we are just off this US election, not to bring it back to that again, but women did go out and vote. But it is interesting to see, okay, if we do take this to the extreme, like what does that electoral map start to look like? And again, not all women are going to be voting for, the left wing or the more left wing candidates. But I think I think those risks are very, very real.
Yeah, and I mean, actually, something that a theme in the election, Liz Cheney kind of came out and said, "Vote with your conscience." I'm campaigning for Harris, and various kind of MAGA figures were really horrified by this. And I don't remember the name of the guy at the Fox News pundit who said, if I found out my wife was voting for Harris, it would be like she was having an affair. There was this theme throughout the campaign of men basically saying, a woman should be voting with her husband and should be telling her husband who she's going to vote for, which kind of which relates to that. If women are suddenly, there are people who think that maybe a woman's right to exercise her democratic vote should be kind of aligned with her husband, which is quite a chilling theme in this election, I think.
Yeah, and I mean, we had campaigns literally from the Democratic Party, and again, with all the things I've said about not necessarily thinking that campaign was particularly effective, but there's a reason they ran videos in certain states that said like, oh, he doesn't, like those videos that said like, oh, he doesn't know what's happening in the booth, and like you can tell him you voted for Trump, but don't worry, you can vote for Harris. Like that does really speak to where we're at the moment, and I just can't think of a time in the last, I mean, not that I can remember elections from 30 years ago, but like I can't remember, in my lifetime, I can't really think of when we would have had a similar kind of video that I'm sure for some people was actually, relatively speaking, effective.
Mm-hmm. I wonder if we might just kind of throw things forward. So, we've been looking and talking about a political culture that is connected to this like online culture that's, about more like conservative traditional values. But if we throw this forward, so we're going to be going into another 4 years of a Trump presidency where there's plenty space in mainstream media for conservative voices, as well as this like now established kind of landscape in non-traditional media as well. It's speaking to people about, with misogynistic values or maybe just, conservative values. So where is that going to take us, do you think, in the next few years? Where does this movement go and why does it matter?
Yeah, I mean, I think that for me, and I don't necessarily think that I think there certainly are differences in terms of on a political policy level between a Trump second presidency and what would have been a Harris presidency. Like, I think that that's like objectively true. However, I think where the biggest, longest term impact is in the political discourse element. I think it's that it gives sort of this seal of approval to all of this kind of stuff. And you certainly are not going to be having any sort of advocacy from anyone at the top. And again, like it's not just Trump. Like the Senate is now a Republican held Senate. We don't know what the House is going to be like, but it's certainly going to be, if it's any, I don't know if the House has been called in the time since I've last checked, but like it will certainly be leaning Republican or it will be very gridlocked. I just think that you're going to have so many prominent figures on so many different levels encouraging this kind of discourse and doing nothing to mitigate it because it's effective for them. It's why Donald Trump is here. So I just think that what the real, again, you could talk about policy, which I'm certainly not an expert on, but I think what the big difference is that this does probably end up on a slipstream. I mean, one of the things when I spoke to all these different experts was platforms. They were like, algorithmic transparency. We need people that are heads of social media platforms to be doing more to try to mitigate this content. And of course, who is one of Trump's biggest backers, both vocally and financially, is Elon Musk. And so you do end up in this sort of situation where you just have people who are, I guess you could argue, are incentivized to keep this kind of discourse going. And those are the people who are going to be making decisions. And I think that's where the real risk is in terms of like, I guess like the Overton window shifting like even further than the insane ways it's shifted in the last 8 years.
Sarah, thank you so much for joining us. And thank you for writing such a fantastic piece. If you want to read it, you can read it online or pick up a copy of Prospect magazine.
Thank you for having me.